My name is Jill Phillips, and I'm the creator of Whose Shoes, a popular approach to co-production. I was named as an HSJ 100 wildcard and want to help give a voice to others, talking about their ideas and experiences. I'll be chatting with people from all sorts of different perspectives, walking in their shoes. If you are interested in the future of healthcare and like to hear what other people think, or perhaps even contribute at some point, Whose Shoes Wildcard is for you. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Wildcard Whose Shoes podcast. Thank you to everybody who listened to my recent episode around storytelling. It certainly created some ripples. One of the ripples it created was that my friend Pippa Kelly got in touch and we had a fascinating conversation about storytelling, and specifically the storytelling work that Pippa is doing now and how it came from the ripples that I created by connecting her with one or two interesting people back in 2015. I love the power of connecting people with shared passions. You don't always know where it leads, but it's so lovely when you do get to hear the stories that ensued. So today I have great pleasure in welcoming Pippa Kelly. Pippa is an award-winning blogger, journalist, dementia campaigner and public speaker, author of Invisible Ink, and host herself of the popular Well I Know Now dementia podcast. Pippa is one of my Dementia Challengers friends and doing wonderful work in this field. Pippa's podcast is much more structured than mine, which isn't difficult. So it will be interesting to see how our very different styles come together in this rather JFDI podcast that seemed a natural outcome of our conversation last week. So welcome, Pippa. Perhaps you could start by telling us, how did you come to be a dementia challenger?
Well, thank you, Jill. It's absolutely lovely to be here. It's really nice to see you. And I don't know, you seem to be very structured in your podcast, so I don't know why you said that. It all seems very professional. How I became a dementia campaigner, in 2 words, is by mistake. I mean, I didn't set out to be a dementia campaigner at all. My mum developed dementia, but as with so many families, actually we didn't recognise it at all for what it was. The word was never mentioned. We just thought mum was becoming more eccentric. But without taking up too much of your time, partly because we didn't recognise it and partly because of mum's always her character, I mean, forget about the dementia, always her very strong-willed character. She refused to move out of a house that was patently inappropriate for her and Dad, and because of that, matters came to a complete and terrible catastrophic crisis, really. And it was over one terrible weekend that Mum got her dementia diagnosis. And I wrote about that really shocking, traumatic weekend. I was a freelance journalist at the time, and I wrote about it in the Sunday Express. And that was the first piece I wrote about my mum's dementia. And it elicited a great response from people, a very large response, much larger than I or the editor, I think, expected. And really, from then on, I began to write about mum's dementia. And ironically, really, I wrote more about my dad, they were both very old and they were both very ill. And my dad didn't have dementia, but physically he became worse and worse. And I charted my parents' sort of decline really in their final years in the national press, in every paper, The Guardian, The Times, The Telegraph, Express. Began to get a bit known as somebody who wrote about elderly care and elderly care issues and dementia. And then after Mum died, I set up my blog, which actually, I don't know if you know this, but to begin with, my blog wasn't really going to be a dementia blog. I just thought it would be a blog, a way, because I was writing about other things as well at the time in the newspapers. But it soon became apparent that people wanted me to write about dementia. My readers let me know that. So then it became a dementia blog. And then that's where you came in, Jill, because in order to sort of publicise my blog, I went on Twitter.
Right.
At the time, you had your thousands of followers, and I had zero, nada, zilch. Which I had absolutely, in fact, zero. I can remember when I got 100, it was like huge excitement in our household because I got 100 followers. And you scooped me up under your Dementia Challengers umbrella. And I have to say, and I will say it now, that was hugely beneficial, and I'm forever grateful, because I honestly don't think I would be where I am today in the dementia world, wherever that is, without you. Seriously, I'm not just saying that 'cause I'm on your podcast, because that really was very, very beneficial. So then I set up my blog, and then won an award, started to be asked onto panels and things, and before I knew it, in a very embarrassing moment, actually, I discovered that I was one of the UK's top 10 dementia influencers.
Wow, yeah.
My husband had a piece of software, and I was meeting somebody from the Alzheimer's Society who was asking about who the influencers were in the sector. So my husband printed off this piece of paper before I went to the meeting with this woman, and I handed it over at the meeting, and she said, "Oh, well, so you're on it. You're number 7." And I said, "What?" I hadn't even looked at the piece of paper. So that's all to do with algorithms. I mean, I still find the whole thing a bit ridiculous, but so that's really how I found myself as, a dementia influencer, dementia campaigner. And then in 2020, at the beginning of the first lockdown, I set up my podcast, something I wanted to do. And it's not the sexiest of podcasts, it's a dementia podcast, but it has proved amazingly popular.
It certainly has.
And I suppose really all along the way, I've been storytelling, or listening to other people's stories, or as a journalist, I am well aware, I'm trained in the power of the story. But that's how I became a dementia campaigner, and as I say, it was completely by chance, really. I mean, I have no professional qualifications, or I have no health background, no social care background. I just had a mum who had dementia, and I was a journalist, and the two came together.
And I think that's how it works in this world, isn't it? So many of the fantastic people that I meet and indeed am talking to on the podcast, they're doing something now that's amazing based on something that they probably didn't choose, something that's happened to them personally, perhaps an illness, or, like in your case as a family carer. It is a lovely thing to see when people can put something that really isn't great to such positive outcomes, I think.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying, Pippa, about the power of Twitter, that was such an interesting time, because obviously it was a much earlier stage of my Who Shoes journey. It must have been, it's more than 10 years ago now. And I think I was discovering the power of a hashtag.
Yeah.
So people can look it up now, that the hashtag Dementia Challengers.
Yes.
And that in itself was able to bring this wonderful network of people, quite often like little people doing very big things, punching above their weight, people like Sarah Reid and Susie Webster, and our little gang came together, didn't we?
Yes, and a great example of that, which I did used to use in my storytelling, was the way that the late, great Kate Granger used her hashtag, Hello My Name Is, which became a global campaign. And just for anyone who isn't aware of Kate Granger, she was a young geriatric consultant who developed terminal cancer herself and found herself on the other side of the doctor's desk, as it were, as a patient rather than a doctor. And during her treatment and repeated stays in hospital and barrages of tests, etc., she realised that there was something very wrong with the way that healthcare is delivered in this country. And she used her already significant social media presence and set up the hashtag Hello My Name Is, push health professionals and others working in social care and healthcare to introduce themselves to patients, and in so doing make that all important human connection. It was an extremely successful campaign.
It certainly was, and what an amazing example of really making a difference.
And what you're saying about the way people can use their own personal sort of stories of often difficulties, whether it be a relative with dementia or whatever it is, and turn that to some, just to helping people. I remember that first piece I wrote about my mum's dementia, high up in the story, because of course it was a story. It was a personal story, but it was also a universal story, as it turned out. I remember saying in this newspaper piece for the Express, I'm writing this story to let others know they're not alone. And of course, that's what resonates, this feeling of not being alone. You think you're the only one who's going through these terrible situations, whether it be a spouse of somebody with dementia who's being woken up all night, every night, because, their loved one with dementia thinks it's the daytime and it's 2 a.m. in the morning or whatever it is. But to know that other people are going through it and that they've survived it and that they've come out the other side, and, that life isn't all bleak. It's a surprisingly beneficial power of communities, actually, that I think is now obviously being recognised, but certainly wasn't. It's a sort of soft power there, and it's hugely beneficial.
And I think helping yourself, just finding that group of like-minded people or people who just happen to be in a similar situation. But I think the very interesting side of that is also how empowering it is for people to come together as a positive force for change, encouraging each other a little bit more, be a bit bolder, perhaps give that talk, tell your story at a local conference, regional conference, national conference.
Yes.
You can see people growing in terms of their stories and what they're prepared to, what they're able to share and prepared to share, because it's difficult, isn't it?
It is difficult, and that's also very interesting. I had Beth Britton on my podcast, I think it might have been last year, and obviously both of us have told our different, very, very personal stories. I don't know how many times, in Beth's case, and we were saying, because as we talked, we both were caught out by our emotion. You think you're beyond it, and you think that you've grown inured to it, A, because time has elapsed, and B, because you said it the same words, the same story a few times, and then something might happen and it just catches you. And yes, it is difficult, but it is hugely rewarding to know. I remember one speech I gave actually at a carers conference, and I was telling the story, and I did decide very early on when I started, when I wrote that first piece about my mum, actually, obviously I got my family's permission. In fact, it was the only time ever I've used a pseudonym in a newspaper, because both my parents were still alive. It was a year after the actual terrible weekend. But I decided I had to be very, very honest. There was no point embarking on any of this unless I was prepared to be completely honest about everything. And when I'm talking about the emotions I went through, because I had it in stereo, I had it with my mum and my dad for what we've now worked out was 10 years, I did begin to feel, particularly, it's a bit ironic, but particularly my dad's side, because my dad wanted to remain independent in the flat and my mum went into a nursing home. So actually, although that became what I'm known for, the dementia side of it, mum was in the nursing home, and in a sense I felt she was safe, she was being looked after, and it was really dad that I had to plough all my energies into, because he was in a flat, so I had to really do much more for him in different ways. And to be, I had to have counselling over this, because deep down in me there was a bit of resentment, and that's a word that is difficult to say, because I absolutely loved my dad. I really did. In a way, my dad was a softer character and easier to love than my mum. My mum and I had some difficult times along the way.
Yeah.
I was very much, my dad was just a lovely, lovely man. But my whole life, and I was young then, and I had a young daughter, and I had a husband who was building his business. And I found that so much of my time and emotional energy and physical, energy was being taken up with dad. And at a very deep level that I didn't even recognise, let alone articulate, there was a sort of resentment. I began to get angry, and it was actually Charles, my husband, who said, I think you need to go and see somebody because you're angry, Pip, all the time. And I sort of said, I'm not angry. But it was the hospice that Dad was under offered counselling. And I went, and we did talk this through. And of course, I then found, it's a very common emotion. It's like, really?
Yes.
Is it? What, to be resentful of, because I thought it was such a horrid thing to feel. I felt like a monster. Anyway, when I gave this speech, I remember sort of looking up. There were about 200 people in the audience at this carers conference in Oxfordshire, and I was recovering from a cold and a cough myself. And I looked up and thought, oh God, everybody's got colds. And then I thought, oh no, they haven't. And then I thought, oh my goodness, everybody's crying.
Goodness, yeah.
And I at the end, it was when my book had come out, so I was signing sort of doing book signing as well, and I said to people, I'm so sorry, and I said to the organisers for reducing, at least half your audience to tears. And they said, no, they're good tears. And everybody came up to me and they said, no, thank you. And that's a word I heard such a lot. Thank you. Thank you for voicing what we dare not voice. Because I'd said about this resentment, and they said, oh my God, thank you for saying that. It doesn't mean you love the person any less. As you said, Jill, it's just you don't sign up for this. You don't know you're going to become somebody's carer. And I never think I was my parents' carer. I wasn't, I wasn't 24/7 like Susie Webster was.
No. It just unblocks something, doesn't it? We're all sitting there with our own personal stories, and stories are all about resonating with people, aren't they?
Yeah.
We're all sitting there in our own little worlds.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
to give people something that they just feel, that's me, or I could do that,
Yes.
or that's so just refreshing to hear that I'm not alone.
Yes.
It's interesting, I think, the whole thing around people telling their stories. One of the things that I'm very passionate about is supporting those people, because it's a really big deal. We've actually got a poem, we use poems a lot in Whose Shoes, as you know,
Yes.
about standing up and telling my story. And I think it's exactly that you've said, that you can't take it as read that anybody, if it's a genuine, passionate story, something on that day might trigger in some way, or just to go back to being part of the audience of a conference. It's not good enough. You need somebody to be really nurturing that person after they've told their story, and if they're going to stay to the conference, look after them, make sure that they're psychologically safe, really, and they're able to join in and be part of things, rather than just the token speaker that's been wheeled in to tell a story. It's far, far more than that.
Yes, and I think you need to be aware as well. I mean, now that I do the storytelling sessions, which I know you want to talk about, but we've had a few, the people that organise it and I have had a few conversations around whether we need to give trigger warnings, because it is quite powerful. And if somebody's, there was a woman, and I think it was her mother, had recently been diagnosed. And so what I was talking about in my own personal story, might trigger me, and it was quite funny, because you have to laugh in some sense.
You do, you really do.
And I kind of believe in black humour, so you've got a sort of way to deal with it. But I might tell you in a minute about when I was myself telling it, got a bit triggered, but also somebody in the audience did, and you have to be sensitive to that. So now, without giving away what it's about, which can reduce the power of the story, you can say, look, I think they know, I think they know if they've got to Google me to see what angle I'm going to come in at. So they know it might be dementia related. And if somebody wants to get up, walk out, if they feel they don't want to be for this particular little bit of the session when I'm telling this quite powerful, rather moving and quite painful story, then just feel free to leave. It's not rude. Just look after your own sanity, your own health, your own mental and emotional health here, because you just need to know that everybody understands, really, and everybody's reaction will be different, and also your reaction on a different day at a different time will be different. The chap who's a lovely guy who organises and facilitates these things, which that's all a long story that we'll come to, how I got them, the connection bit of it all, said, I think you should get the train, Pippa. It was up in Luton or Bedford or something, and I am very happy to drive. I said, no, I'll drive. And of course, every train was cancelled. The trains were cancelled. A fantastic Uber driver said, no, I'll take you to here, to there, to everywhere. And anyway, the upshot was, having set off at about 7 a.m. to get to this thing well in time for 1 o'clock, I was billed as the 1 o'clock speaker. I arrived, which was unbelievable, really, given everything that had been thrown at me. I honestly thought I wasn't going to get that at all. I skidded to a halt in front of the audience at about 10 past 1, 10 past the time I was due to give the speech. And obviously I was quite rattled and extremely stressed by this journey. And there are 2 points in the story I tell that I know I've got to arm myself for. And I normally do. And I don't want to start emoting all over the place. I need the story to be powerful, not me standing there a quivering wreck.
Yes.
I'm not I don't want to do a whole sniffy emote. I need the story to be powerful. So I want to keep the emotion out of my voice, out of my body language. And I do normally succeed, but on this occasion it was quite interesting. I was completely tripped up. I was completely ambushed, and I just had to stop for a moment, which I didn't like. And I felt, and they were very sweet, but I said no, because I don't like to show the emotion. But it was just because I was in such a stressed state when I arrived. Obviously, I wasn't able to arm myself as I normally do. And so it's quite interesting how close to the surface one's emotions are.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that phrase you've just used, to arm yourself, things that you don't perhaps consciously realise that you're doing. Yeah?
Yes.
Interesting. So how did you get into real storytelling, standing up and giving storytelling talks? Is that where we go next with this, Pippa?
Yes, very good question. And this is very convoluted, and I hope I get from A to Z, because along the way, one of my points in the storytelling is what makes a good story. And the first point is that it must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I'm just praying that this story is going to have a beginning and a middle and an end, because it's quite long, isn't it? And it involves you, Jill, again.
Well, you told me a bit last week, so I can help with the various points as well, I think. So we'll do it between us.
Yeah. So it all began, I'd set up my blog. My blog was going. We used to meet, didn't we, the little Dementia Challengers group. And we were at dinner one night in London, all in a restaurant. And you had something that you were doing for Dr. Mark Newbold.
That's it.
And he was chairing a commission into the urgent care of older people. And he'd asked you to do something. You, surprise, surprise, were mega busy. And you said, would anybody else like to come up to Coventry and meet Mark with this group of a couple of people from the NHS, and there was somebody from social care, and the person was going to contribute from the dementia aspect, I think, or from a relatives aspect, maybe. Anyway, I put my hand up, because I'm always game for anything. So I said, yes, I'd love to do it, Jill. I'll go up there. So I went up. I was quite careful, actually, Jill, that I didn't go up and relate personal stories at all. I actually mined into the Dementia Challengers group and put it out on Twitter and said, I'm doing this. Anybody got any points they'd like to make about the urgent care of older people and their experiences of it? And I went up and I gave all the opinions that I gathered from the Dementia Challengers group, and actually thought I've told enough about my story, so I didn't really use anything personal. And then the session finished and people just went away their separate ways. And then Mark Newbold and me, and there were a couple of people from the NHS, were left. And I think I was waiting for my train or something. And it so happened that my father-in-law had recently died. And as we were chatting, I just, I think came up, he said, I said, oh, it's quite interesting, because I said, actually, what's interesting is that my father-in-law was called Morris. And I said, and actually Morris's care was exemplary on the NHS at the end of his life. It was just exemplary. Couldn't fault it, really. And then I said, I haven't said this. I didn't want to say this in the session, Mark, but my father, and I've written about it quite a lot, had some terrible episodes of care. I hate to say it, but, at the hands of the NHS. And I said, and what struck me and my husband when we were kind of talking about this, actually before I came here today, but I didn't want to sort of witter on about this, was the fact that all the points that made Morris, my father-in-law's care, so very, very good were the same points and issues that in their negative form made my own father's care so very poor. And what it all boils down to, the nub of it, is that in Morris's care, all the way through, they put Morris at the centre of their care. They saw him as a person and they put Morris right at the centre. In other words, it was genuinely person-centred care, a phrase which at the time was being bandied around a lot. And I said, but in my father's case, they completely ceased to see him as a person. And they were worried about protocols, rules, regulations, and they trumped everything, including the person who should have been at the very heart of their care. And as I was telling Mark this, he was very interested, and he got more of the actual story of each case out of me.
Yeah.
And then when I got home, I got an email from Mark, and he said, look, that was fascinating what you told me. And the reason he liked it was because it was the comparison of the two, the good and the bad, and the way that what made one so good and one so bad was the same thing. It was whether or not the person was put at the heart of the care. In Morris's case, very much so. In my father's case, not at all. And he said, would you write the foreword to the Commission's report? I said, I'd be honoured, and I wrote it. On the back of that, I was asked to give a talk, really to bring to life the foreword, and give a talk on what really amounts to person-centred care, I suppose, but it had rather lost its value, that phrase, because it was being bandied about so much. It kind of cheapened its currency a bit. And then I gave the speech at the NHS Confederation, and then in the audience of the speech was Dr. Adrian Hayter.
Right.
And he was head of a CCG at the time, and he asked me on the back of that to come and give a speech to their AGM, very much again around the power of person-centred care. And I remember, I think Mark had asked me to give a title to my speech. Adrian certainly did, and I gave as the title to that speech, at the heart of all care is the person, the patient. And I remember I started the speech by saying, I know that sounds absolutely blindingly obvious that at the heart of all care is the patient, but actually you'd be surprised how often it's forgotten. And then from that AGM came again through Adrian a connection with, he was part of Frimley 2020 leadership programme, and this was an NHS programme for managers within the NHS who were wanting to advance their careers, and it was a leadership programme. And then as part of it, somebody had the idea that they'd seen that what I was doing through stories was to influence people, to steer them to certain ways of thinking. And obviously as a leader within management, that's what you need to do. You need to bring people with you, whether it be your team, whether it be because you're making a decision about the merging of two hospitals or whatever it is. And so could I come along and give a session as part of a much, much broader programme that might last, I think some of them last a year or two, and just do a session for 2 or 3 hours on the power of storytelling. And, you know, I always like to say yes, so I said, well, I'd love to, but I was thinking, oh my goodness, this isn't well out of my comfort zone.
Fantastic opportunity. I love that.
But a fantastic opportunity. So I went along. The first one was at Royal Holloway, and I was a bit trepidatious. I mean, I thought, wow, these are scientists, these are senior managers in the NHS, and this is little old me. And it was quite interesting because I think there was a lot of cynicism. I don't know, I'm speaking for them, but I would have been cynical. I definitely would have been cynical myself. But then there came that moment, and you often talk about your lemon light bulb moments,
I do.
Jill. And there was a definite lemon light bulb moment because I can't remember exactly when in the proceedings, but I did feel, oh dear, I'm not sure I'm bringing them with me here. And then suddenly, probably when you ask, has anybody got any questions? A senior consultant put his hand up. And it's quite interesting, actually, that even when you're an audience member, as opposed to, it's a bit like being a patient, you know, you become a little bit more hesitant about things, you know. So there is this senior consultant and there is me, I mean, nothing. And yet he was quite hesitant about a certain vulnerability, isn't there? And he put his hand up and he said, yeah, you've really made me think, because my dad is, you know, I can't remember now, but say 80. He's got some very rare condition and he's being treated at the moment. And every night when I get home, this consultant was saying to the room, he phones me up and he tells me what's happened. And he says, so what's happening? Let's call the consultant Phil. I can't remember what it was called. And the consultant said, and me and Dad, we talked through what was happening. And the way, you know, what you've been saying, Pippa, I realised that what happens to all the other people, the other old people who are having things done to them and they don't have. And his father was a retired GP, and he said, and my dad's a retired GP, so actually he's quite well placed to know himself, but he doesn't know what the hell's going on.
Classic.
And he phones me, we talk it through, and I reassure him. But what do all the other people do that don't have a son who's a consultant or don't have a son? And I think it might have come on the back because at that time I was using the Kate Granger story. At one stage of the Kate Granger story, she says, you know, I was in hospital, I had got yet another infection, I was in great pain. And I think about 15 professionals came up to see her, and she said not one of them introduced themselves by name or by title.
Shocking.
And there's something wrong here. So she introduced her hashtag, hello, my name is. Clever hashtag. Just like any clever slogan, any clever soundbite, any clever headline. Hello, my name is so simple. Hello, my name's Pippa. But actually, what lies beneath it is a human connection. Hello, I'm here for you. My name's Pippa, what's yours? It's that human connection which is so often lost in that relationship between the cared and the cared for, whether that be the surgeon and the nurse and the patient, or the social care professional and the person with dementia, or it's just that human connection. And I think that's what you and I are all about, Jill. Just reminding people gently about that, maybe, or I don't know.
And interestingly, I think quite a few people say that it was because Kate Granger was a doctor that people really heard that and listened to that.
Yes.
That if any kind of just ordinary patient, if you like, had tried that campaign, it would never ever have taken off and been so successful.
Yeah.
Which is, in terms of the power and the hierarchy and so on, there's a lot there as well. It's a fascinating area, but it is all about that human connection. And I pick up, as you know, like little who's shoes scenarios as I go. And some of the things you're saying are jumping out to me. So one of my lemon light bulbs, if you like, is what happens to the people who don't have a consultant as a son, and just how complex the system must be that it takes that to unravel it. And within that family, that would be normal, or I'll just talk to my son tonight and he can explain it all because I hadn't got a clue what was going on. And I suppose that's at the heart of our work, isn't it? To make things simpler and more person-centred genuinely, rather than wrapped up in gobbledygook or complication.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm cynical enough, I am at heart a hack, a journalist. So certainly with both my parents, to go back to their stories, where I battled, and I do use that word advisedly, and it was a battle. And I waged a battle first for my dad and then for my mum to get NHS continuing healthcare. And I'm afraid I'm cynical enough to think there's a little bit of deliberate complication there and confusion.
Oh, yes. Big time.
There's an enormously long form
that
you have to fill in. But all it is a form that you have to fill in. And they call it, for a start, the jargon is, it is a diagnostic support tool. No, it's not. It's not a diagnostic support tool. It's a form.
Yeah.
To use, who's going to understand what a diagnostic support tool is? I wouldn't have the foggiest what it is. They baffle people into submission. And I'm sorry, but I can still actually get very angry about aspects of both my parents' care.
Yeah.
And I do have to be careful that I don't, but I can, because at the end of the day, it is simple, as you say. At the end of the day, as I once said to a nurse assessor who came round to assess my father for continuing healthcare, at this point my father was lying in bed, completely immobile, being fed by a peg tube in his stomach, unable to speak. And she came along and said she had a conversation with him about Shakespeare. And impossible, for a start. But what struck me was, as we had this conversation in one room, and just the other side of the wall was my father dying, she had completely lost sight of the fact that what we were all really there for was a dying man who was my dad.
Yeah, the person.
We were sitting there discussing whether he scored. I know you have to do this, don't get me wrong. I know you have to score people. You can't go dishing out money to anybody. But we were discussing at great length, she and I, just separating us from my dad, who was dying, was a wall, whether he scored 3 or 4 on his, whatever level, whatever category it was, his skin function, his diet.
Yeah, horrible things to be talking about, really horrible.
Completely lost the any kind of sort of respect or dignity. And at one point I did have to say, we're talking about my dad. And you know, and I know, that he's being fed by a peg because he can't swallow, he can't speak. So how on earth did he have a conversation about Shakespeare? And I know where she was able to say that, because one of his carers was called Portia. And she will have said to him, the nurse assessor will have said, "Oh, Mr. Kelly, Portia like the Merchant of Venice." And he would have gone, "Whoa, whoa, whoa."
Yes, yeah. And then that becomes him talking in depth about Shakespeare.
And even now, telling you that, Jill, makes me get very emotional and very angry.
Yeah. And already we had exactly the same experience. We really did. So Colin, my husband's mum,
yes,
we were sitting there, it just takes you straight back there. We were sitting in a small room in the hospital with that same group of people around, talking about pressure sores, talking about skin quality. And all I could do was try and sort of contain my anger, just like you, in terms of whether it was a 3 or a 4. And I thought we could be visiting her at this moment, and she was across the way, in the ward, and we were in a little room, and it took me straight back there, Pippa, exactly the same. And I mean, it's a resource allocation filter. If they want a 3-word term for the form instead of just form, and the level of education. I mean, you think how much speaking English as a first language, being articulate, being educated, having the time,
hours,
and ability to go into the system and understand it.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think that's where the power of stories comes in, because when you just said that, took me straight back.
Yep.
And that's when your story has landed. And I see sometimes when I'm talking about the power of stories, I see people in the room often kind of nodding. They just start nodding.
Yeah.
Because they're there. And that's why it can be difficult and it can trigger people. And, you have to be careful to warn people. But that's sort of what you want to do. And that's why stories are so powerful, because they connect through the heart. And there's nothing you can do about that. This is what advertisers know. Think John Lewis advert at Christmas, I mean, very difficult.
Yes.
And another thing, and I only thought about this recently, actually. So one of the occasions when I had to, I think everybody has to appeal their NHS continuing healthcare. So this was my second round, because Dad had died and I was now appealing for Mum. And people kept saying, "Oh, you'll never get continuing healthcare for your mother because she's got dementia, and people with dementia just don't get continuing healthcare." And I was like, but then my very, very nice social care manager was saying, "No, your mum definitely qualifies for this now, Pip." So I said, "Okay, well, I will gird my loins then, Sylvia, and I will go into battle for her." And she said, "You go into battle for her." And I said, "I will." And I, of course, turned down in the first try. I flew back from a holiday to go to the appeal panel. God knows how much these appeal panel cost. There were about 7 people around the table. And when I arrived, the lay chairman had a quick chat with me, and he said, "Tell me about your mum." And I told him. And I told him in a very brief form this terrible story that led to her diagnosis. And then we were walking down to the room where the appeal panel was being held. And he said, "Are you going to tell the appeal panel about that story of your mum's diagnosis?" And that had been, several years earlier. Her dementia was very advanced by now. I said, "Well, no, I wasn't going to, because it's a long time ago." So here am I, the professional storyteller. I didn't see the power of that then, because he said to me, and again, it's human connection, isn't it? Because I would be thankful to this man, whoever he was, because he said to me, I would tell them that story. I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, tell them that story." So I said, "Okay." So I went in, and when they said to begin with, "Would you like to tell us anything?" I did tell them roughly the story. And of course he was quite right, because actually I saw some of them round the table. I sort of got them by the short and curlies. And then when we began to discuss in great detail these scores on this diagnostic support score, and whether Mum scored, this, that, or the other, and why I felt she should be scored higher on this one than they'd given her, the psychiatric nurse around the table began to go on about my mum's antidepressants.
Right.
And I'm thinking, why is he going on and on about her antidepressants? Because her dementia is very advanced, and to be honest, I'm much more worried about this, that, and the other. But what he'd done was he'd seen a way in, as it were, I think. And he was thinking, we can definitely get the scores up here.
Right, so playing the system and goodness.
Playing the system for me because I'd grabbed him emotionally. I grabbed them all emotionally, I think, with the story because they were thinking, it was head and heart, they were thinking, we've got to give this woman.
Yeah.
This is such a terrible story. But their head was saying, but we can't. Because, of course, continuing healthcare does boil down to money in the end. And then, I think about 2 days later, I got the email saying she's been awarded it.
The power of storytelling. And that's incredible. And I'm sure we could talk for a long time about continuing healthcare. And my mother-in-law, it was dementia. And just like you say, it was almost impossible. And we actually ended up getting continuing healthcare, I think about 2 weeks before she died. And you think all that time, effort on everybody's part, it was misdirected. It needed to be put into either making things happen faster or caring for her or visiting her.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I didn't get my dad's continuing health care until after he died. And at one stage when I was pushing and pushing because it went on for months and there were huge delays in, when you could get the appeal. And I kept saying, we need the appeal panel now because he's dying. And I got a letter from them.
Yeah.
I think I've still got it somewhere in all my files. And it said, Dear Miss Kelly, be assured that we deal with the appeals in the chronological order in which they come in, the living before the deceased.
Wow.
I remember standing, we were in a different house then, but I remember standing in my study there and just going, and feeling the world kind of rock. The living before the deceased. This was when my dad was still alive. You think, what are you putting people through? I mean, what are you doing? Where is your humanity?
Do you remember my mum?
I do.
And, obviously you do remember my mum, but specifically the certificate of existence we had to fill in for the pension scheme.
Well, that really is all well in, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've got a video of mum saying, sadly she is no longer here, but I exist.
I exist.
And, it's just so insulting,
It is.
to have to fill in, I think it was once a year, and they called it that, a certificate of existence.
Well, that is, I'm sorry, I just wonder if that's a joke. That is just really
off the scale.
Yes, because the thing is, I completely understand that we're talking about a lot of money. And I'm sure one of the reasons why it's difficult for somebody with dementia, as we know in terms of hospice care and all this, is that people with dementia can live an awfully long time and you don't know it's very difficult, the prognosis, isn't it, to know the journey, when it's going to happen and that. So it's extremely difficult to sign off the money. I can see all that and I'm very rational about all that. And it's got to be carefully regulated. You can't just dole out money to somebody who says, oh, by the way, my mum's got this or my dad's got it. You've got to go and make sure that this person qualifies for it. But there are ways to do it. And
ways not to do it. So I was interested, Pippa, coming back to it, inevitably we're going off in all sorts of directions. It's so interesting. Continuing healthcare wasn't on our radar and now it's central to the conversation because it's just such an emotive one, isn't it? But I was interested in your storytelling and doing the fabulous storytelling work that you're still doing, I think, are you, for the NHS Leadership Programme?
I still am, yes, amazingly.
And you mentioned to me one of the stories that came from that.
Yes, absolutely. So as I said, I would be very cynical about it myself, but we've honed it over the years and possibly it has become a stronger, more powerful, to coin a phrase, tool in itself. But I'm now able to say if people are at all sort of cynical, because I often say the first question I'd have is, yes, but does it work? It's all very well having a nice sort of 3-hour session that might be a bit softer than some of the other sessions. But Pippa, you're a professional storyteller and okay, but that's all right in your setting. But does it work in our setting as whatever they might be? And it's health and social care. And so I'm able to say in a word, yes, it does work, because there was this amazing story that came to me there was a woman on the course. It was over a year ago now. And let me call her Anne. That's not her real name. But Anne was a manager. And as part of her job, she was a manager for a large geographical area for young adults and children with severe mental health needs. And Anne had gone to the Better Care Funding Board to apply for some very specific funding, which was so that she, who was well placed, could target the funding where it was absolutely needed. And on 3 previous occasions, when she'd gone for the funding, she'd been turned down. And then she said, I came to your storytelling session that was part of their 2020 course, and I thought, I'm going to apply once more to the Better Care Funding Board, because this funding is really important to the people I serve. Because one of the questions I pose when I do the storytelling session is, this is a very specific form of storytelling that we're talking about here today, and it is storytelling with a purpose. You know, you want this story to achieve something, to help you to achieve whatever it is, your goal. So the first thing you need to do actually is think, well, what is the purpose of this? You know, what is the purpose of my role and what is the purpose of this particular story? And so Anne had gone away and thought, so what is the purpose of this? And what is the purpose of the funding? And I also say to the people on the course, actually, if I was giving this session to another group of people, I might say, you've got to go and find the stories. But I said, you don't have any problem finding the stories. You are surrounded by the most powerful human stories you could ever wish for.
Constantly,
because by very nature of what you do, if you're in health and social care, you are dealing with people at the sharp end of life in whatever way. They're bound to be in some sort of difficulty. So it's just a matter of choosing the right stories for the right purpose. So she went away with all this in mind, and she thought, well, yes, I am completely surrounded by stories, so I'm going to use some of these stories, as Pippa has shown me. And so she thought, yes. And she said she had 2 or 3. And I'll tell you one that Anne told me she had. She said, I had this woman, and she had a son, and he was 21, I think it was, and he was above average height. He was overweight. He had bipolar disorder. He had autism, and he was schizophrenic. I may have got one of those 3 wrong, but anyway, this was a chap with a few problems, a few issues. And on more than one occasion, this woman's neighbours had to call out both the police and the ambulance to deal with situations because he was prone to outbursts of violence, this son. And the poor mother's marriage had come apart as a result of all this. And she'd given up work to look after this son.
Yeah.
And
so the whole story of the family, isn't it? What's happening?
Yes. And when she'd gone to the local authority to ask for funding, and this rang, I don't know if it'll resonate with you, Jill, but this resonated with me. The local authority said, oh, yes, we know what you need.
Cynical laugh, yeah.
We will place your son in residential care. And she said, this woman said to Anne, no, my marriage has imploded. I've given up work because I want to look after my son. Don't they understand? I love my son and I want to look after him. Yes. It's not his fault that, X, Y, and Z keep happening. I want to look after him. And actually, all I really need is 5 hours of respite care a week. That's all I need. I don't need a residential place. I don't want a residential place. So in fact, it's going to be cheaper for them. But nobody thought to ask.
Much, much, much cheaper.
So Anne went along for the 4th time of asking to the Better Care Funding Board. And this time she related this and another 1 or 2 other stories as to why she should get the funding. And then she backed this up with the business case and the stats and the facts and the figures that she'd given on the previous 3 attempts. And this time, she got it. Using the power of the stories, she won £3 million worth of funding.
£3 million, wow. And the data and the statistics didn't get through to them, but the stories did.
And then this is a quote from, let's call her Anne, the woman who attended my storytelling course. She said to me, we use complex pathways in our work, but we forget that they involve people and humans with stories. We need to think about them.
So those early ripples, I'm fascinated by ripples, and I'm thinking how my story and sort of my involvement fits around what you said. So, if we see that sort of path, if you like, that ripple between you getting involved with Mark Newbold. But how did I meet Mark Newbold? I didn't know Mark Newbold. Well, actually, I'd done a talk, so this goes back to 2015. I'd done a talk at the NHS Confederation.
Oh, yeah.
So it was Rob Webster that set me up to do that, which was really brilliant. I didn't know Mark until that, but Mark was chairing the session where I gave my talk,
Right.
which was a lot of storytelling.
Right.
I remember talking about my mum and,
Yes.
exactly the same kind of stories, what would keep her independent at home and how little that would cost compared with the big formal stuff and the, would take somebody into care or whatever. No, we don't want that. And then Mark inviting me to get involved in that commission. And like you say, I was busy. I look back at that and I think, how come I was so busy not to get involved in something interesting, sort of pretty much on my own doorstep?
You were very busy.
But it was because of Mum. I was busy with Mum at the time. And I think we were going through, Mum was living with me. She'd had a fall. We were working out what to do.
Yes, of course you were. Whereas both my parents, you see, by then had died. Because 2014 I set up my blog because Mum had died then. Yeah.
So, it's how these stories all interweave, isn't it? And then for me, it's been fantastic, Pippa, because, you sow seeds. I'm a big seed sower, if you like, and I love connecting people. But it's so lovely when, not that often really, I guess, you get to hear the detail of what really happened as the result of, perhaps throwing that pebble in the pond, connecting somebody, inviting them, and then, how it builds and grows, and your incredible sort of work around storytelling, and to be influencing those senior people in the NHS, and for one of them to be able to put in and succeed in getting that £3 million. Now that's only one of the outcomes that you know about, so there'll be other ripples going on elsewhere that you don't know, all those other people sitting in the room, what they might have done as a result of it. And that's what I find fascinating.
Yes, no, they have got other results. I know that, some bigger and some smaller, but they've said how things have changed within. So it doesn't have to be money related either. That's a very tangible example, but it can be like the way that meetings that were becoming very difficult, have become easier. It's about being slightly vulnerable, because I think, as we were saying right at the beginning of our discussions, in order to tell a personal story, you are putting yourself out there a bit.
Yes.
I tell you who else I think, and I hope she won't mind me saying this, but I think has used stories very powerfully and very positively, but it is at a personal risk, and vulnerability. It's Kate Lee, Chief Executive of the Alzheimer's Society.
Yes.
I saw on Twitter during COVID, during the terrible times when people couldn't visit their mothers and fathers and what have you in care homes, and people with dementia, and there were the terrible window visits, which actually were far too confusing and painful. A lot of people just decided they would rather not, they couldn't do it. It was putting their loved one in too much confusion to even go there. I saw this picture on Twitter, this little video of a woman visiting, obviously a parent in a care home, a window visit. And I thought, Kate Lee has retweeted somebody. And then I thought, no, it is Kate Lee. And she's visiting her own mother with dementia. And then I contacted Kate and said, would you come on my podcast? And she explained it all. And she'd actually done the little video on her iPhone to show her dad, to explain to her dad how it would work if they went and visited her mum.
Right.
In the care home and did a window visit. She was up in Scotland, it was blowing a hoolie, and it was all very, very difficult. And then she decided to put it on Twitter because it was such a powerful little video. And what a powerful impact that had. But she is the chief executive of the biggest dementia charity, and difficult thing to decide to do. You do put yourself and your family actually in quite a vulnerable situation.
But I think if we don't do that, if none of us do that, then none of this, good work and the lemon light bulbs, they don't happen. Yeah.
No, quite.
And I guess where I'm doing that particularly, and again, I think we're all getting bolder over the years. And one of the amazing links really between us and with the Dementia Challengers work is the phone call that I got from Florence Wilcox saying, I've been watching what you're doing in dementia, around dementia care. Do you think Whose Shoes would work in maternity?
Yes.
And me being able to use all the learning that I got in terms of the power of a hashtag, dementia
Yes.
challenges, hello, my name
Yes.
is, and to come up with the MatX maternity experience hashtag and how that has all kind of taken off. So I think in terms of my work and storytelling and so on, the thing that I've become much kind of bolder with really, and again, you've got to kind of risk yourself a bit and vulnerability, and can I really say that? So in our workshops we have people making pledges from the heart. If it's not from the heart, then don't make a pledge. But I think sowing that lemon light bulb idea that individuals can actually make a difference without having to wait for permission. And what I do is invite people, if they've written a pledge, who is it that's just so passionate about what they want to do that they want to share it with the whole room, which is very different from perhaps going around and saying, we'll have one person speak from each table, or all that stuff that kind of like knocks all the energy out of it. And then if we're doing that live session in the room, then I can pretty much guarantee now that whatever anybody comes up with, I can connect them to somebody who's perhaps equally interested in that area, already doing something so that they don't have to start from a blank sheet, a community of people that they might be able to link to, which makes it all more fun, less lonely, more impactful.
Yeah.
But I've only been able to do that really by gathering so many stories from so many different parts of the system and feeling, I've got something that's a little bit different that I can offer there now, because the way that we go and run workshops across so many different services.
Yes, they are amazing.
And with so many different teams, and the graphic records that Anna Gaia produces and so on, that I can see these kind of commonalities and threads between services. And it's all people. It's just all people. And whether it's maternity or whether it's dementia, that vulnerability, that wanting to be heard, to be listened to be taken seriously, to be valued, that's what it's all about.
I think there are one or two people, who are the most amazing connectors of other people, networkers, but connectors. And you are one, Jill. My God.
I love it. I do. I love it.
You do love it, yeah. And I say that Dr. Adrian Hayter is another who's brilliant at doing that. Some people are just very, very good at it, and it's very it's very selfless as well. I think you're very generous of your contacts and your time and your energy. So thank you. I mean, I think it's brilliant, because I honestly meant that. I don't know that I would have got anywhere really. I would have probably still be floundering around in the tens of Twitter followers.
Well, thanks for saying that, Pippa, but I mean, I find it rewarding, and I'm sure Adrian does as well. I think just to connect people, I mean, I've got my thing now, #intentional coffee.
Oh, right.
And honestly, I've got certain people that I think they, however busy they are, they need to connect with each other. And the most outrageous thing I did was actually I gave a talk with someone called Mary Salama, who's one of my favourite NHS consultants. She's a paediatrician in Birmingham, and I was absolutely determined for her to meet, in inverted commas, Joanne Minford, who's a paediatric surgeon that I've done amazing work with in Liverpool. And I joined them live on a conference. They'd never spoken to each other before, and we did a video link and got the two of them talking. And then, of course, they get to the point where, you can't shut these people up because they're just connecting so strongly.
Brilliant.
And that was recorded on video. It's very powerful stuff.
Yes, I'm sure.
But just bringing the right people together, Well, Pippa, how did that work for you? Am I less structured?
It's brilliant. I knew. I mean, it would be, Jill. I'm pleased to be able to have the, opportunity to just sort of say thank you to you publicly, because I really mean that. I've said it a lot to Charles, my husband, and I really owe a lot to you.
Oh, well, thank you.
No, and I think it's just brilliant what you do. Yeah, keep doing it.
And how these different threads and ripples go around.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a pleasure.
And thank you, for coming along and telling us a bit about your work. I mean, obviously I can include some links in the notes to the podcast and so on. And, hopefully more of my gang will get to hear about Pippa Kelly, and we haven't even mentioned Invisible Ink, your amazing novel. So
Yeah.
I'll put the links in the notes, and hopefully people will know a lot more about you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Jill.
I hope you have enjoyed this episode. If so, please subscribe now to hear more of these fascinating conversations on your favourite podcast platform, and please leave a review. I tweet as Whose Shoes. Thank you for being on this journey with me, and let's hope that together we can make a difference.